Battle of Moscow is the name given primarily by Soviet historians to two periods of strategically significant fighting on a 600-kilometer long sector of the Eastern Front in late 41 and early 42. The Soviet defensive effort frustrated Hitler's attack on Moscow, capital of the Soviet Union, and the largest Soviet city. Moscow was one of the primary military and political objectives for Axis forces in their invasion of the Soviet Union, known as Operation Barbarossa. The German strategic offensive, named Operation Typhoon, was planned to conduct two pincer offensives, one to the north of Moscow against the Kalinin front by the 3rd and 4th Panzer armies, simultaneously severing the Moscow-Leningrad Railway, and another to the south of the Moscow Oblast against the western front, south of Tula, by the 2nd Panzer Army. Initially, the Soviet forces conducted a strategic defense of the Moscow Oblast by constructing 3 defensive belts and deploying newly raised reserve armies, as well as bringing troops from the Siberian and Far Eastern fronts. Subsequently, as the German offensives were halted, a Soviet strategic counteroffensive and smaller-scale offensive operations were executed to force German armies back to the positions around the cities of Oryol, Vyazma and Vitebsk, nearly surrounding 3 German armies in the process. The original German invasion plan, which the Axis called Operation Barbarossa, called for the capture of Moscow within 4 months. By July 1941, Army Group Center had managed to encircle Soviet armies near Minsk during the Battle of Bialystok-Minsk, creating a huge breach in the Soviet lines. By August, German forces had captured Smolensk, an important stronghold on the road to Moscow. And although a decisive Axis victory, the Battle of Kiev later in the year set the German blitzkrieg against Moscow even further behind schedule. As Guderian later wrote, Kiev was certainly a brilliant tactical success, but the question of whether it had a significant strategic importance still remains open. For Hitler, the Soviet capital was practically irrelevant. He was haunted by the fate of Napoleon, who had taken Moscow but failed to destroy the Russian army. He believed the only way to bring the Soviet Union to its knees was to destroy it economically. Franz Halder, head of the Oberkommando des Heers, or the Army General Staff, was convinced that a drive to seize Moscow would be victorious after the German army inflicted severe damage on the Soviet army. This view was also shared by most of the Germans in the High Command. Therefore, the city was the primary target for the large and well-equipped Army Group Center. The forces committed to Operation Typhoon included 3 armies and the Luftwaffe's Luftflotte 2. Overall, more than 1 million men were committed to the operation, along with 1,700 tanks and 14,000 guns. German aerial strength, however, had been severely reduced over the summer's campaigning, as the Luftwaffe had lost 1,600 aircraft destroyed and just over 1,000 damaged. Because of this, Luftflotte 2 had only 549 serviceable machines. The first stage of the Wehrmacht plan was to be a double pincer performed around the Soviet Western and Reserve fronts, located around Vyazma. Facing the Wehrmacht were 3 Soviet fronts formed from exhausted armies that had already been involved in heavy fighting for several months. The forces committed to the city's defense totaled 1,250,000 men, 1,000 tanks, and 7,600 guns. The Soviet Air Force had suffered appalling losses of some 7,500 aircraft, that being a conservative estimate. Extraordinary industrial achievements had begun to replace these losses, and at the outset of the campaign, the Russian Air Force could muster just under 1,000 aircraft, 578 of which were bombers, specifically for the defense of Moscow. Troops and weaponry, while presenting a significant threat to the Wehrmacht based on their sheer numbers alone, were poorly deployed in a single line with few or no reserves to the rear. In his memoirs, one of the Russian commanders, Vasilevsky, said that while immediate Soviet defences were well prepared, the errors in troop placement were largely responsible for the Wehrmacht's initial success. Furthermore, many Soviet defenders were seriously lacking in combat experience and some critical equipment, such as anti-tank weapons, while their tanks were obsolete. The Soviet command began constructing extensive defences around the city. The first part was built on the Reserve Vyazma-Bryansk line. The second, the Mozhaysk defence line, was a double defence stretching between Kalinin and Kaluga. Finally, a triple defence ring surrounded the city itself, forming the Moscow defence zone. These defences were still largely unprepared by the beginning of the operation, because of the speed of the German advance. Furthermore, the German attack plan had been discerned quite late, and Soviet troops were ordered to assume a total defensive stance only in late September 1941. Near Vyazma, the Western and Reserve fronts were quickly defeated by the highly mobile forces of the 3rd and 4th Panzer Groups that exploited weak areas in the defences and then quickly moved behind the Red Army lines. Contrary to German expectations, the encircled Soviet forces did not surrender easily. Instead, the fighting was fierce and desperate, and the Wehrmacht had to employ 28 divisions to eliminate the surrounded Soviet armies, using forces that were needed to support the offensive towards Moscow. In the south, near Bryansk, initial Soviet performance was barely more effective than in Vyazma. The 2nd Panzer Group executed an enveloping movement around the whole front, linking with the advancing 2nd Army and capturing Orel by the 3rd of October and Bryansk by the 6th of October. By the 7th of October, the German offensive in this area was bogged down. The first snow fell and quickly melted, turning roads into stretches of mud, a phenomenon known as Rasputitsa in Russia. German armoured groups were greatly slowed and were unable to easily manoeuvre, wearing down men and tanks. The 4th Panzer Division fell into an ambush set by Dmitry Lelyushenko's hastily formed 1st Guards Special Rifle Corps, including Mikhail Katukov's 4th Tank Brigade, near the city of Msensk. Newly built T-34 tanks were concealed in the woods as German armour rolled past them, as a scratch team of Soviet infantry contained their advance. Soviet armour attacked from both flanks and savaged the German Panzer IVs. For the Wehrmacht, the shock of this defeat was so great that a special investigation was ordered. Guderian and his troops discovered, to their dismay, that new Soviet T-34s were almost impervious to German tank guns. As the general wrote, our Panzer IV tanks with their short 75mm guns could only explode a T-34 by hitting the engine from behind. Luftflotte 2 flew 1,400 attacks against Soviet positions to support the 4th Panzer Division, destroying 20 tanks, 34 artillery pieces, and 650 vehicles of various kinds. Elsewhere, massive Soviet counterattacks had further slowed the German offensive. The 2nd Army, which was operating to the north of Guderian, had come under a strong Soviet counterattack. The magnitude of the initial Soviet defeat was huge. According to German estimates, 670,000 soldiers were captured by the Wehrmacht in both pockets, although recent research suggests a lower, but still enormous, figure of 514,000 prisoners, reducing Soviet strength by 41%. Because of the heavy resistance on both the northern and southern sides of the city, on the 1st of December the Wehrmacht attempted a direct offensive from the west along the Minsk-Moscow highway near the city of Naro-Fominsk. This offensive had only limited tank support and was forced to assault extensive Soviet defences. After meeting determined resistance from the Soviet 1st Guards Motorized Rifle Division and flank counterattacks staged by the 33rd Russian Army, the German offensive stalled and was driven back 4 days later in the ensuing Soviet counteroffensive. On 2nd of September, a German reconnaissance battalion managed to reach the town of Khimki, some 8 kilometers away from Moscow, and captured a bridge here, which marked the furthest advance of German forces on Moscow. The temperature had dropped far below freezing. On the 30th of November, von Bock reported to Berlin that the temperature was -45 centigrade. General Erhard Raus, commander of the 6th Panzer Division, kept track of the daily mean temperature in his war diary. This diary shows a suddenly much colder period, between the 4th and 7th December, from -36 to -38. Other temperature reports varied wildly. Zhukov said that November's freezing weather stayed around to -7 to -10 centigrade. The absolute numbers did not match to the German troops, who were freezing with no winter clothing, and whose equipment was not designed for such severe weather. More than 130,000 cases of frostbite were reported among German soldiers. Frozen grease had to be removed from every loaded shell, and vehicles had to be heated for hours before use. Of course, this weather affected the Russians as well, but they were far better prepared. The Axis offensive on Moscow stopped. Guderian wrote in his journal that the offensive on Moscow had failed because they underestimated the enemy's strength as well as his size and climate.